Welcome to the Blue Security Podcast, a weekly podcast for information security defenders, where we bring you discussions on best practices, tools, and implementation for enterprise security. Now, here are your hosts for today's show, Andy Jha and Adam Brewer.
Welcome to this week's episode of the Blue Security Podcast. I'm Andy, your host.
I'm Adam, your co-host, and welcome to episode 300. And thank you, listeners and viewers, for being a part of our journey to 300 episodes. We'll celebrate our 6th anniversary later this year, but 300 episodes is also a significant milestone, and thank you for being part of it. Andy, do you have anything you want to say about episode 300?
Yeah, it's been a long journey. We started this as a passion project. I remember talking with you when we were working together the first time and saying that we should just start this. And then we just went ahead and did. And we made a commitment when we started this podcast to not just be kind of a one and done or be very sporadic about our episodes. And we've committed to releasing an episode every single week for 300 weeks. And so it's been a labor of love, and thank you for, listening and watching every single week. I know that we get fans all the time. I'll talk in different calls with customers or sometimes put on last week I did a AI security fundamentals where we had a bunch of customers join, and one of them was a fan of the show. So thanks for following along and listening, and we hope to have many more.
Since July 1st of last year, I know we have had listeners from over 100 different countries around the world, which is just incredible. I never in a million years thought we would have such tremendous reach. So again, thank you. We're not going to spend a lot of time patting ourselves on the shoulder. Cybersecurity is ever evolving, and tonight's episode certainly reflects that. And before we get into it, I'll just mention our standard disclaimer. Andy and I both work for Microsoft in our field security sales. However, we record the show outside of work on our own time and self-fund the show. The opinions you're about to hear expressed are those of Adam Brewer and Andy Jha, and do not necessarily reflect those of Microsoft Corporation. And with that, on with the show.
All right. So today I wanted to talk about Anthropic and the ongoing saga that has been, kind of hammering that company. And so there was a lot of news this week. Fable 5 was released, which is a new supermodel, and then they were slapped with some export controls. And so before we get into that, though, I want to kind of do a little bit of history on this, because what the United States government did this week is not something that is out of the ordinary. It's something that has happened before. So the government has tried to control technology in the name of national security, and there's some historical context on this. So back in the early 1990s, strong encryption was actually classified as a munition under the Arms Export Control Act. And that's not really a metaphor. It's literally the same legal list as weapons, like tanks, and everything that's regulated under ITAR, which is the International Traffic in Arms Regulation administered by the State Department. The practical effect that had was that U.S. companies could not legally export software with strong encryption. And at that time, SSL, which was the protocol that protects all of our web traffic, it meant that it would have a hard cap of 40-bit key lengths for anything going overseas. Domestic U.S. users got 128-bit and everybody else got 40-bit. And so companies like Netscape and Microsoft had to actually maintain two separate code bases. One that was a strong domestic version, and then another one that was deliberately weak for international users. The 40-bit ceiling was not a minor inconvenience. It's actually brute forcible. So it was weak by design because the government mandate said that it had to be in the name of, quote unquote, national security.
What's interesting also, if you ever wondered, why did Lotus Notes become so popular? Why did I run into that so many places? Well, putting aside for a second, one of the benefits of Lotus Notes was it was also a very simple app dev platform, and a lot of organizations used it to do some really simple in-house app dev on a database. But the other part of it was IBM and Lotus had formed an agreement with the United States government to where they could have 128-bit encryption globally as long as they gave the government the part of the key. So it was effectively 40-bit encryption for those overseas use cases as well. And I'm glossing over some of the details there, but effectively you saw things like this where if you used Exchange, you were limited to 40-bit encryption. But if you used Lotus Notes, you had 128-bit encryption against everybody except the United States government. So there were different ways different software companies worked around this, but one of the reasons Lotus Notes became popular, especially in regulated industries, was that 128-bit global capability. So it just goes to show you, like, we take for granted having strong encryption that is not decipherable even by the United States government is a relatively recent development in technological terms and historical terms, to where we've only had that now for about, well, less than 30 years. And prior to that, that wasn't available, which is really just incredible to think about.
Yeah, and those controls were eventually loosened when, the rest of the world could simply just build their own encryption. Like other countries started building their own, and then the US realized that it was mostly handicapping its own industry by having this rule in place. So the problem is that there was a lot of legacy damage that happened because of that policy. So SSL was designed with an export mode baked into the protocol, which meant that it had a fallback to those weaker cipher suites. And so when the restrictions were lifted, nobody ripped that out. And so legacy software still depended on it, and it sat there dormant in every single SSL and TLS implementations for more than 2 decades. And that was something that we as cybersecurity professionals had to deal with. And then in 2015, researchers disclosed the freak attack, which was the factoring RSA export keys. And so by forcing a connection into that old 1990s export mode, an attacker could execute a man in the middle or attacker in the middle and crack the weaker keys. And the computation, that required this kind of brute force back in the 90s would have cost some serious hardware. But then in 2015, it costs about $100 on, like an Amazon EC2 or an Azure VM, So, and there was about, at that time, 12% of all of the popular websites were vulnerable to that type of attack at the time of disclosure, including like big ones like AmericanExpress.com, Bloomberg, Marriott, USJobs.gov, and even the NSA's own public website was vulnerable. Ed Felton at the Princeton Center for Information Technology Policy put it this way: the NSA's own action in the 1990s to weaken exportable cryptography boomeranged at the agency 20 years later. His closing line was, next time you hear a government official ask to modify a security system to protect their own access to data, ask yourself, what are the side effects? How do we know we won't regret this later? And so that's kind of the thing that we're asking here because of what happened this week with Anthropic.
And we've talked about this concept in other ways. We have spent more than one episode of this podcast talking about the very famous showdown between Obama administration's FBI and Apple Incorporated over a shooter in San Bernardino who had an iPhone that the FBI could not decrypt. And they had demanded Apple create a version of iOS that had a backdoor built into it that could be loaded and flashed onto that iPhone so the FBI could extract the data from it. And Apple steadfastly refused, and it became a big, as so many things are, maybe less of a political football than it would have been today, where I'm sure the president would have had very measured comments on Truth Social and stuff like that. But it was a big thing, and people took sides, and Apple dug their heels in and ultimately prevailed. The Obama administration's FBI went and bought, I think, from one of the groups in Israel, and had bought those decryption keys instead. And
one of the tools.
Sorry, not decryption keys, but like a backdoor tool, and broke in and found nothing valuable, which is neither here nor there. But just to say, we have these ongoing conversations about restricting access to technology in some way to benefit the government, and it tends to have negative consequences as a result. And Andy, I think in our next segment, we're going to get into another example of that.
Yeah. More recently, you can kind of fast forward to 2020s, and this pattern repeats itself again, where instead of encryption keys, now we're talking about AI chips or GPUs. So, starting in October of 2022, the Biden administration at the time imposed export controls on advanced NVIDIA GPUs, specifically the H100, the A100, and then their successors. And they were mainly targeting China, where their goal was to limit China's ability to develop frontier AI models and advanced supercomputing. And the strategy was described by Biden's national security advisor, Jake Sullivan, as a small yard, high fence, tightly targeted restrictions on the most critical choke points. However, there was a problem. China had already started to stockpile these chips before the controls took effect. And then a company, which we talked about on the show, DeepSeek, it rattled the US markets in 2025 because it trained its models largely on the NVIDIA H800 GPUs, which were acquired legally before the Biden administration closed those specific export windows in 2023. Foreign policy describes it as an ever expanding game of whack a mole where the US government was swinging a beat too late. And so when the DeepSeek R1 model dropped, the performance shocked a lot of the Western analysts. The NASDAQ, I remember this day because the
I remember
NASDAQ
it distinctly.
fell 3.1% in a single day. And then there was like this uncomfortable realization that China had achieved a near frontier AI capability, despite the fact that the years of export controls that the US government had levied against it. And it's not that the controls had no effect, but analysts argued that because they did meaningfully slow down the pace of China's innovation. But the implementation left critical windows open and those thresholds were miscalibrated. And so the timelines were telegraphed in advance, giving the Chinese companies a lot of time to stockpile before those restrictions kicked in. And so one of the things DeepSeek's CEO said directly was that the only thing constraining them was access to compute. And Jack Clark, who is the co-founder of Anthropic, also echoed that same view, saying the only thing standing between DeepSeek and matching Western frontier labs was access to chips. So the controls weren't completely irrelevant, but in general, that wasn't sufficient. And a lot of people actually argued that it wasn't the right path to take. There were a lot of workarounds that the Chinese eventually got to. Now, when the Trump administration came into the picture, they kind of went the opposite direction. They rescinded the entire export control, and there was Biden had this AI diffusion rule, which was a framework that would have sorted more than 100 countries into tiered export restriction levels. But Trump's administration rescinded that. And then during a trip to the Middle East, Trump approved massive chip exports to Saudi Arabia and the UAE, about 500,000 advanced NVIDIA chips annually to the UAE and hundreds of thousands more to Saudi Arabia's sovereign wealth fund-backed AI company, Humain. I think that's how you say that. Humain. And they're not just like the old chips. They're like the most powerful chips available, the Blackwell class GPUs, which are the same generation ones that are fully restricted from China. The Trump administration's reasoning was that restricting allies was pushing them towards Chinese AI vendors. Huawei and Alibaba had been gaining traction in the Gulf precisely because of US controls made American chips unavailable. And so his thought was better to sell to allies under security agreements than cede ground to China. However, right after that, there was a big security concern. The U.S. intelligence agencies had previously warned that the UAE's G42, one of the primary recipients, could serve as a conduit for siphoning advanced technology to China. Analysts at Carnegie also noted that the scale of compute being shipped to the Gulf is larger than any AI training cluster currently in existence. And so the chips going to allies with close Chinese ties could end up training models that find their way back to Beijing. So in the span of a few years, Biden restricted chips to slow China, but China found a way anyways. Trump reversed the restrictions to court allies, and those same allies have documented ties to the entities restrictions that were originally designed to contain. And the controls, I would say they're not for nothing, but the net result was an accelerated global AI race with more powerful chips in more hands than before. So
the story is still being written here. And so history will give us the benefit of hindsight eventually. But I think there is certainly value in NVIDIA being established as the only true path forward for AI models, especially for frontier AI model training. Now, while inference has clearly become more commoditized with time, and inference costs are being driven down dramatically as Amazon has Trainium, our own employer Microsoft has Cobalt and Maya, their own accelerators. Obviously, Google has had their Tensor chips the entire time, and they've always trained on Tensor. You're seeing diffusion in inference. However, training really does remain NVIDIA's game, and there is intense strategic value in NVIDIA being the only game in town. And by restricting this flow, you also have the example of you are strengthening the desire of Alibaba and Huawei to compete, as opposed to just ceding the ground to NVIDIA. Now, China certainly has a very strong motivation to own and control technologies. They want everything homegrown. And that's a well known fact of how China thinks and operates as a government. But you can certainly slow the development of that if NVIDIA is so clearly better and they want to maintain frontier capability of giving them access to NVIDIA chips as well. So there's a lot of complexity here, but you can clearly see the sense of, if nothing else, that there is no clear right answer and that the different decisions being made don't seem to accomplish the goals anyway. Whether it was Biden administration's restrictions, China worked around it in different ways. Andy, you didn't mention it. I think they also distilled models as well to create DeepSeek. DeepSeek was clearly distilled from OpenAI and Anthropic models. There's also just the fact of now with some of the Trump administration strategy, it's going to allies that are more neutral and may also deal with China, and they may find their way into Chinese hands anyways. Now, it makes sense, don't restrict allies, but to hurt them because they might find themselves turning to China and being in the arms of them. If nothing else, listener or viewer, your takeaway from this should be there are no clear right answers. So sometimes allowing the market to solve itself is maybe the right answer. If we are, in fact, staunch capitalists, then allow capitalism to solve it. Instead of all of this intervention, is this actually helping accomplish anything? That remains unclear. History will give us the benefit of hindsight eventually. And Andy, I hope we're still doing the show long enough that we can go back and look on this in, say, another 300 episodes and kind of look back and say, hey, how silly all these things we talked about. But the point is, export controls are hard and they don't always deliver the outcomes you expect they will, and they don't always benefit the country in the way you expect they will. And I think that's what we're trying to tee up here for our conversation from the news this week.
Yeah, exactly. And that all that historical pattern matters here, right? And so thanks. That was a really good summary there, Adam. So that brings us to this week, June 9th, which was just a few days ago. Anthropic launched Claude Fable 5. And so if you've been following along with the show, you've heard us talk about Mythos before, which was Anthropic's most capable model class, which was previously locked inside of a program called Project Glasswing, which was limited to a small group of trusted cybersecurity defenders and critical infrastructure partners. The reason for that was that Anthropic's own assessment was that Mythos had some serious offensive cybersecurity capabilities, and in the short term, a freely available Mythos could give attackers an advantage in finding and exploiting software vulnerabilities.
I'm going to call BS on one term there, freely available, Andy. It should be fair to point out Mythos is extremely expensive to operate and has the highest per token cost of any model that is available even for semi-public consumption, which of course Mythos is gated to only Project Glasswing participants, but very, very expensive to operate.
Right. I think in the it's obviously it costs money.
Yeah.
I think just being available
I'm
to
just being
like the
nitpicky here.
public. Yeah, for sure. Okay. So Fable 5, what is Fable 5? Fable 5 is Anthropic's attempt to kind of thread that needle, right? It's the same underlying models as Mythos, but with some safety classifiers layered on top. So when a query touches a high risk domain like cybersecurity or biology or chemistry, the model actually automatically reroutes to a lesser powerful Opus 4.8 model. Anthropic said that more than 95 of Fable sessions never hit those classifiers. And the Mythos 5, the unrestricted version, still stays locked inside the Trusted Partner program. So Fable 5 was what the rest of us can use. And actually, as a subscriber to Anthropic Claude, I had access to it for a little while. I didn't use it, but I have been fascinated this week by seeing like on Twitter all the different things that people have been doing with Fable 5. Like people have coded like entire like video games and stuff like that. So it's been pretty cool. Like someone made their own like Minecraft clone, like the entire game. So it's been pretty cool to see. But what happened shortly after that, 3 days after the launch on June 12th, Anthropic received a formal directive from the US government citing national security authorities.
So it should be pointed out, by the way, this timing, June 12th, which is Friday, at 5:21 p.m. Eastern time. So effectively close of business on Friday. I think that is relevant to point out of when this came down.
Yeah. They received this right at the end of the week, close of business, and it was basically suspend all access to Fable 5 and Mythos 5 for any foreign nationals inside or outside of the United States, including Anthropic's own foreign national employees. And the problem is like built into like the Claude app and everything, there's no verification. So there's no way to really like verify the nationality of anyone. Or if you're calling the API, again, no verification has been built in, right? It's not like when I created an Anthropic account, I had to upload my passport or anything like that, right? So that part of it isn't there. So the only thing that they could do was pull the models for everyone globally immediately. So like when I bring up my Claude app now, it literally just said, it used to say like at the bottom, like at the beginning of the week, it said, try out Fable 5. And it was like kind of included for a short period of time for people to try out. Now it says Claude Fable 5 is currently unavailable. So why did they do this? Why did the US government do this? Well, their concern was a jailbreak. In the directive itself, there were no written technical details, but based on a demonstration that they were shown, Anthropic described the technique as asking the model to read a specific code base, identify security software vulnerabilities, and the same capability is available to GPT 5.5 and other publicly deployed models. So security defenders are using this exact technique daily to find and fix bugs before attackers do. There was a researcher supposedly known as Pliny the Liberator who publicly claimed to bypass Fable 5's safety layers that we talked about before, shortly after launching using a multi-agent prompting. Anthropic has publicly disputed the claim separately, standing behind their classifiers. There were 2 separate jailbreak claims in the same week, both contested by Anthropic. So Anthropic's defense, they issued a statement. They said that they conducted thousands of hours of pre-launch red teaming with the U.S. government, the UK AI Safety Institute, multiple private organizations and internal team, and no tester found a universal jailbreak, a technique that broadly unlocks the model's capability across multiple domains. What the government was shown was a very narrow and non-universal jailbreak. So I think there was possibly a jailbreak, and the knee-jerk reaction from the government was to slap this export control. And Anthropic has this entire response to it that we'll link in the show notes that you can read through. But their response was that there's no perfect jailbreak resistance for any model. Every frontier model has non-universal jailbreaks. So Fable 5 was built with defense and depth strategy, and that makes non-universal jailbreaks as narrow as possible and makes universal jailbreaks very expensive to produce and backs it with monitoring. So they also have they require a 30-day data retention from Fable customers, which is a real cost they absorb to enable rapid detection and response. So Anthropic, basically, their bottom line is if finding a narrow, non-universal jailbreak is sufficient grounds to recall a commercial model, that standard would have halted every frontier model deployed in the industry today. Any thoughts on that, Adam?
Well, I think before I opine on this, let's bring in the next bit of context too from the rundown because I think that's relevant here and I want to reference that. So let's hit on that and then I'll jump in.
Okay. Yeah. So all this, all this backstory that we kind of talked about matters because none of this happened in a vacuum. If you've been following along, we talked about this. Anthropic is already in an active legal conflict with the Trump administration. Before Fable 5 launched, there was that Pentagon deal that we talked about a few weeks ago that collapsed. Anthropic was subsequently designated as a supply chain risk. They sued in federal court and won a preliminary injunction blocking that designation while the litigation continues. And then when this export control landed 3 days after Fable 5 launch, Anthropic was already fighting the government on a separate legal track. So whether the jailbreak concern is kind of the full story or part of a broader pattern is the question the courts will probably have to answer eventually. But Anthropic said that the action does not adhere to the principles of transparency, fairness, or technical grounding, which is their words from their blog. So, what I think you guys should take away from this is really, the history of all this, right? Like in the 90s, our government, the US government, mandated the weaker encryption and export controls. US companies were forced to build two versions of everything. And that broken version, I should say, left a attack surface for researchers and attackers that they're still exploiting, 20 years later in the form of freak.
Or it was forcing you to use the god awfulness that is Lotus Notes as well.
Right.
And you can also blame that on this too.
Yeah. And then in the early 2020s, the government restricted GPU exports to slow Chinese AI development, and Chinese stockpiled those chips before the controls kicked in because we telegraphed that. Then they built DeepSeek anyways, matched a near frontier capability on older hardware, and then the restrictions did have some effect, but not the effect intended, which is kind of what we're talking about here, right? Like not in the timeline needed. And the same government then reversed course, flooded ally nations with chips at scale that dwarfed anything that was previously available, and then included countries with documented ties to China. And now that same government is trying to apply export control logic to AI models. This time, it's not the chips, it's not the encryption keys, but it's deployed software service. And it was pulled globally on the basis of a narrow, unwritten, verbally described jailbreak concern. So, not great. Anthropic is complying, but they are disputing the technical basis. So the jailbreak at issue is asking AI to analyze a code base, surface vulnerabilities, which is a standard defense security workflow. That's something that any defender is going to do with AI. As soon as we get the model, we're going to ask for that. And so any of the security practitioners listening to this show who use any AI assisted code review, vulnerability discovery, red teaming tool, you're doing exactly that thing with AI. So pulling a model for this capability while leaving it available in others does not really reduce the risk. It applies that standard unevenly to one company with no transparent process. And so, as I asked in the beginning here, with that question that Ed Felton had asked in 2015, what are the side effects of this, and how do we know we won't regret this later? So, as of right now, like I said, Fable 5 and Mythos 5 are offline. The API calls are failing. Claude Code and Claude.ai fall back to Opus 4.8. And right now, there's no restoration timeline announced. Anthropic is committed to publishing additional technical details, but it's ongoing. So they're trying to figure out what to do. But as of now, the Fable 5 and everything is shut down.
So the reason why I wanted you to expand on this past when you just kind of laid out Anthropic's side of the story was, hey, the government called us up, said, yo, it's Friday afternoon. We found this jailbreak. It's not universal, but it's something that lets people send code to Fable 5 and have it do effectively vulnerability testing. And you need to pull this and ensure that no foreign nationals can access this. You do have to view this through the lens of, and again, we say all the time, this is absolutely not a political podcast. However, I think regardless of the side of the aisle you sit on, or if you're an independent, you can say that this administration does have a history of leveraging its power in petty and malicious ways. And there is ongoing litigation with Anthropic. Anthropic did win a temporary injunction against the government, against the Department of Defense, and they don't like to lose. So they're leveraging their power in other ways. Now, the other fact of this that is also relevant in general, AI leaders need to shut their mouth. And eventually they are going to learn this lesson. And this is a problem at every company selling AI, including my own employer. Dario Amodei, who is the CEO of Anthropic, was just out in public saying earlier this week that the government needs to do more to or be more involved in like the review and the approval of AI models. They need to be looped into that process. And so then when they did kind of what he was talking about, he said, well, whoa, not like that. I want you to do this thing, whatever he's talking about. And this is the same guy who had everyone convinced that Mythos was going to be the end of days and the end of computing as we know it, because it was going to find so many vulnerabilities and take down everything in the world and, blah, blah, blah. Mythos couldn't be released publicly because it was too dangerous. And it really turned out Anthropic was just grossly compute constrained, had delivered uptime with single nine uptime, which if you're not familiar with uptime, like single nine is bad, and even changed their way their uptime was calculated. Instead of going from a 90-day rolling day to a 30-day rolling measurement, just because 30 days looked better than 90 days because they had had such a checkered recent past. So they've been trying to goose the numbers, control the narrative, say all these other things about like, oh, it's too dangerous. We can't possibly release it publicly, when it was, dude, you just don't have the compute. You couldn't. Your service would tip over if you released it, because again, Mythos, very expensive and computationally expensive to run. Now they've obtained more compute and were able to release this somewhat constrained Mythos model in Fable 5, but then there's CEOs running around talking about how the government needs to be more involved in approving frontier AI models and doing security reviews of AI models. And then they did, and then he got upset about it. So again, guy, maybe just stop talking.
Ironic.
Yeah, I mean, I saw some tweets about it that were supposed to be funny, where it was like, Dario, government needs to be more involved, and then, government does something, and then Dario, but not like that. It was,
yeah.
Anyhow, the guy talks too much and needs to talk less, is the long story short. It doesn't change any of this, right? So I take Anthropic at face value here. I think this is kind of an unreasonable limitation. I expect Anthropic to appeal through the legal system if they're not able to resolve this outside of it. I expect them to win a preliminary injunction, and I expect this to become available shortly. I think in general, these companies need to be very careful about what they're asking for and what they're saying out loud in their public statements. And Anthropic really told this tall tale and made this great show and this great case about how dangerous Mythos was and how it couldn't fall into the wrong hands. And then all of a sudden they released it publicly once they had signed a whole bunch of compute agreements with people like SpaceX, by the way, because no one's using Grok apparently, and so they had plenty of compute sitting around. And then all of a sudden it was safe to release it. Oh, we built all these controls, now it's okay. And you had just spent the previous month telling us like how dangerous this was and it couldn't fall in the wrong hands. You got called on it. Maybe talk less. I don't know. That's, a crazy idea to me. Ultimately, again, I said in the disclaimer at the top of the show, Andy and I both work for Microsoft. Microsoft has been talking a lot recently about a multi-model security harness that can be used to scan code bases. It's called M-. We just did a show on it recently. M- can leverage different models to scan code bases and deliver results. And it does it through a multi-model interface. You can pull in stuff from OpenAI, from DeepSeek, from Anthropic, whatever. It kind of chooses its own models on its behalf. But the point is, no one model is responsible for it. And oh, by the way, it got better results on some of the recent benchmarking than did Mythos. So Mythos, being a single model concept, got beat out by a multi-model, multi-vendor approach from Microsoft that actually delivered better results. And during the May patch Tuesday, I believe something like 12 of the vulnerabilities fixed in May came from codename MDash, came from that tool, had discovered it when they said, here, scan the Windows code base and tell me what you find. And then they patched 12 things that had never been exploited in the wild before they were, which is cool. So, I mean, this sort of thing is valuable and is helpful, but
Definitely.
it is just important in how we talk about it. And I think all of this context is valuable. Andy, I'm so glad you did the history lesson. And I think it's valuable to talk about the ongoing litigation between Anthropic and the United States government. And I think you need to consider all of that when you're looking at this news and you're not taking any of this at face value. This is the cumulative effect of different public statements, different behaviors, different personalities. And with this past history of it, is this probably an effective way to prevent the diffusion of this technology throughout the world and being used against us? That's a great open question. And ultimately, history will be the judge. And I said, I hope in 300 more episodes, we can come back and look at this. But for now, the practical effect is a tool has been taken out of the hands of security defenders around the world. And that's disappointing. I expect a quick resolution on this. I expect a temporary injunction. I'm quick in the sense of the legal system where nothing moves really fast. But if I'm a betting man, this show is going to hit your podcast feed on June 16th. I'll take a bet, Andy. By Independence Day, Fable will have its independence and will be available again, if not earlier. So,
all right, we'll see.
That's my bet. I'm going to put a take out there in the world. But anyhow, great conversation tonight.
Yeah, I do like that you kind of tossed in there the fact that, Anthropic was almost like begging the US government to regulate AI, and then when it did, it was like, but it is, to be fair, it is regulating a little bit unevenly, right? Like it's
correct. Yes.
Right. So I think that's really part of it. And then the other thing is, just in my opinion, I do think that we need some sort of regulations in the AI industry. But the problem is that, if we regulate our AI industry, other, countries like China aren't going to regulate theirs. So we are right now in a very Cold War mentality arms race, right? Because we're afraid that China's going to overtake us if we regulate ourselves and slow ourselves down, just talking about the show here. And so that's the problem, right? Like I do think you need regulation, but it's going to have to come in kind of like a Cold War agreement, like the old Soviet US agreement to, pare down our nuclear weapons. It's going to have to be something like that. Otherwise, it's literally just an arms race between these two major countries. And then I'm sure, other countries are going to get into it, build their own, AI farms and whatnot, and start making models or whatever. But right now, obviously, like China and the US are the two big players in this industry. So,
really valuable point. And the point I was trying to land earlier when we were talking about some of the export controls, how valuable is it from a strategic national security perspective that the dominant silicon vendor is an American company, NVIDIA? The dominant frontier firms are American companies in OpenAI and Anthropic. If you discourage that and prevent the diffusion of those technologies throughout the world, you are just encouraging rival technologies versus you can kind of crush them by scale if everyone else outside of China uses this stuff. Like, feel free to build your own, guys, and roll your own. You're using last generation silicon, you're using inferior models, and you're just hamstringing yourself. And any country that is kind of neutral, like they'll work with China, they'll work with the United States. It's like, well, do you want the okay thing or do you want the great thing? They're going to pick the good thing every time. And so that is strategically valuable. So even that of like limiting the diffusion of NVIDIA and frontier firm technology throughout the world, there is an argument to be made, and we are not going to solve it on this show, that is intensely valuable too, if nothing else. So you're ultimately, by limiting the diffusion of it, you're just encouraging more competitive technology to be built and adopted and gain more scale and gain more traction. Because if a lot of China's allies are really motivated to adopt it, that only further entrenches them and helps them grow. And, with a lot of these AI models, there's knock-on like self-growth effects where the more they're used, the more they can learn, the more it gets incorporated in the model and the model improves. There's that like self-improvement model. So
Yeah.
all of this should be considered. And again, I mean, it's way above our pay grade, but it's worthwhile to have a good conversation about and to go into very eyes wide open.
It's really interesting too. Final thought here, because I was talking with a friend of mine. He had a subscription to ChatGPT, OpenAI, and I have a subscription to Claude, and we were kind of comparing. And he was like, "Yeah, I kind of like Claude more, and I want to get off of ChatGPT, but it's really hard for me because I have all this history."
Yes.
And even though you can export that, it's not the same as when it was kind of built and learned within the model itself. And so once you start using a model and you do use it a lot, it starts to become harder to pull yourself away from that.
Totally.
Yeah. So anyways, so this was hopefully a good conversation for you guys to listen to. I always find this really fascinating, especially the history of it. And this is just kind of history repeating itself. So thanks for listening and watching. As always, the links to the topics that we talked about today will be in the show notes, as well as our contact information. If you have any questions or topics you want us to talk about in the future, just email us. Thanks. We'll talk to you guys next week.
Thank you for listening to the Blue Security Podcast. Please check out the show notes, catch up on episodes you may have missed, and subscribe so you don't miss any future episodes. Find Andy on Twitter @AJaw0 and Adam @AJ Brewer. See you at our next episode.